So today we're dealing with anger part 2. There's not enough to preach one sermon on anger. We need probably a whole year of sermons on anger, but I'm trying to do it in 2 parts, which means today we probably will run an hour long, but don't worry about it. My mom, I have said before, wanted me to be a good boy. There were basic things my mom taught me. And I can say that at least 70% of them could have gone either way. I choose not to remember the 70% of the rules that I broke. I thought she should be lucky if I got 30% of the rules right. After all, batting 300 in a baseball family was something considered to be successful. But one of my mom's primary rules that was difficult was that not only she commanded, but she commanded in the name of Jesus that I not fight. Now remember, growing up in southern Appalachia, being a male with all of those burdens and crazy cultural expectations, that was asking almost for the impossible. So what I strove for is that if I had a fight, Mom not find out about it. And I could, then deal with God on the side. But when you are in early adolescence and people find out that you won't fight, it is a hard thing when there are bullies present. Our school system was going through consolidation. The new high school had not been built on the west side of the county. So the junior high school, as we called it then, 7th and 8th grades, happened to be located on the same campus with high schoolers. The high schoolers were not truly merciful, but sometimes they were at least more compassionate than our peers in 7th and 8th grade. There was a group of guys who found out, in fact, that I would do anything possible not to fight. One of them was what we might call a runt. He was small and I could have taken him. I knew that. I just figured if I fell on him, it was okay. However, he led a group, and they were non-relenting. The last class of the day was PE. I know the teachers like for us to say physical education, but when you're a student, it's PE. The teacher, someone whom I really did like, in spite of the nickname he carried, he was known as Porky Swift, partly because he looked like Porky Pig. And he was assistant football coach. He was one of those people who believed that fighting and learning how to fight was what a man ought to do. I developed strategies to avoid the bullies. After things were over and we were getting ready to go to the bus, I would slip out through the gym because they would wait outside the locker room. And then I would circle all the way around the main administrative building. I went through all kinds of things to not fight. But one afternoon, Coach Swift kept hanging around, and when he wasn't looking, I slipped out through the gym. And as I stepped out, I heard the door locked behind me. And there in the gym, with no one else, was a group of about 7 guys, led by the runt. And it began. And it is one of the reasons why in that old movie, The Christmas Story, I love the Scott Farkus affair the best. Those of you who haven't seen that will have to go back at Christmas and re-watch that movie. It's when the kid has just had enough. And so I stepped forward and something grabbed hold of me that I could never explain, but scared me to death when it was all over. Because suddenly I had no fear, I had no sense of what my mom did or didn't want, and I could have cared less what God thought. I had just had enough. And so I stepped forward, much to their surprise, and it started. When it was over, there was blood. And I don't know who pulled me off of the leader, because his head was going over and over into the gym floor, and I think I would have done permanent damage had somebody not done the kind thing and pulled me off. And around me were other people sprawled on the floor. I just had lost control. And I remember being so frightened, no longer by them, but so frightened by what I could do. So frightened by this demon that seemed to have possessed me. I don't tell this story to glorify violence. God forbid. We've got plenty of people who will glorify violence. I tell this story to acknowledge the danger of anger when you become obsessed with the anger and you find no other recourse but to live into it in destructive ways. It's an awful thing. Most of the time, anger gets expressed, and we talked about that a little bit last week. Anger gets expressed in more subtle ways. And it gets expressed because we're not having our needs met, or we feel disrespected, or fill in the blank. And we choose not to tell people. We'd rather seethe and then be nasty, passive-aggressive stuff. But the question still remains, how is it that we deal with the anger of others when that anger is misplaced or misdirected? Jesus knew that this was a danger. Jesus knew that when you gave in to anger in those kinds of ways, then inevitably you were going to reap what you did not want to reap. In Matthew, Jesus quotes the law. Next week, I'm going to begin a summer series out of the beginnings of Matthew. I'm going to be preaching a series on the Beatitudes. This is a little later on in that 5th chapter, and he begins talking about these antitheses. That here's the law, you've heard it said, but listen. Trying to be a good rabbi, trying to teach those who might have open ears. He focuses in those antitheses that it's not just about our behaviors lived out, but it's also about our intentions. That those intentions, what we feel and how we direct those also can distort our view, disrupt relationships. He admonishes those who would listen to root out evil, to keep away those behaviors, to remember that relationships were meant to be honored, people honored and respected. It has been said, an eye for an eye, and I'm so grateful that when Coleman was doing the Courier before he left, that you'll find on the back the little piece that King said, that also Gandhi was known to have said, that you know what happens if you live by an eye for eye, oftentimes there ends up being two blind people. Or as Gandhi said, the whole world can end up being blind. Nothing comes out of an eye for an eye. And then Jesus gives us that line that's been really hard for young people in Sunday school for as long as there have been Sunday school and teachers, where Jesus says, oh, and by the way, if anybody hits you, turn the other cheek. And of course, when we were children, we would think, how silly is that? A part of it is we don't clearly understand what Jesus was saying because we're too busy hearing it as a literal discourse. Walter Wink, who wrote this incredible trilogy about the powers that be, he summed all the 3 books up in the powers that be. But he didn't do that until the last because he wanted to make sure you bought the other 3 books. And in that book, Wieck identifies what was taking place there because it had to do with cultural strategies. If somebody hits you on the cheek and you turn the other cheek, that person cannot strike you with the backhand because that's incredibly disrespectful. And that person could not hit you with the other hand because the other hand was the ritually unclean hand with which you dealt with toiletry issues. And so what Jesus is saying is, you be prepared. Because when someone comes at you and someone is going to do violence to you, when someone is going to come at you, be prepared. Know how you're going to respond and have some strategy thought out, lest you find yourself giving in to that anger and responding to that violence with violence. You see, it's so easy to sit back and say, well, in theory, I probably would do so and so. But what Jesus is trying to teach, no, don't be talking about theory. Make sure you're clear about who you are and what God's expectations of you are and what expectations you have of yourself. Jesus is saying, be prepared. Be prepared. Don't give yourself simply into other people's behaviors. Jesus might say, if we don't prepare, then we've allowed ourselves to be open to the evil that's at our door. I had a colleague one time, had a temper. And he found out that there was a group in the church who were getting ready to fire him. And so he called me, and he seemed to be full of energy on that Saturday because he had decided that he was going to call them out. Not by name, but call them out because he knew, because of the relationship it had between pastor and parishioner, he knew their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses and their family secrets, and he was going to let it all go. So he was going to attack the people who had allowed themselves to be vulnerable to him in order to try to exorcise a demon. In other words, he was going to give himself to a demon in order to try to get rid of the demon. Doesn't make much sense, does it? It's the kind of thing that grips us. I had another colleague in Cincinnati who had gotten mad at some church members. They wouldn't even try to fire him. He just got mad at him. And so he used the postal system to send them poison letters. It didn't dawn on him that, some of that behavior is federal law. And so not only did he find himself in front of the ecclesiastical commission, but he also found himself facing federal charges using the postal system in inappropriate ways. You see, one of the things Jesus is asking throughout Matthew 5, and you'll hear me say more about this in the weeks to come when we go to the Beatitudes, is that there is a higher righteousness. Not just whether we think in simple terms of right or wrong, but there is a higher righteousness that is God's righteousness, and that we're to strive to live into that with the help of God. Instead, oftentimes we are unprepared. Oftentimes we receive other people's anger and respond in kind. Oftentimes we choose not to listen to find out why the other is as the other is. Wars start that way. Rhetoric starts. World War I is the prime example, where talk becomes more hyperbolic. Listening is set aside, and suddenly you have more than you ever imagined possible. When communication ceases alienation sets in, and any hope for conciliation vanishes. You've heard it said perhaps by some people, I have, well, if that's just the way he or she is, they can just forget about it. I don't care. As Rabbi Friedman would say, that's the old cutoff, that we think we can cut people off and it not have consequences, when in fact, when we cut people off, they're always there sucking energy from us. We just try to pretend that they're not there. Church folk, and every church I've pastored, I haven't had time to hear this here yet, so I'm waiting. If anybody wants to step forward and volunteer at some point, you're breaking a record so far, and it bothers me. I've always had people say in every church I've pastored, they'll end up in the office and say, well, you know, every time I try to do something around here, every time I step forward and do something and give my best, somebody's there complaining that I didn't do it right. That's never happened here. All of you are loving and appreciative of each other. I can tell you've never said that to me. And consequently, the anger begins to build. And then what happens is the person chooses to quit serving, loving the community, building up the community. Why? Because they've reacted to someone else's negativity. They choose to think, well, if that's the way they are, I'll show them. As I was preparing this sermon, I remember that we used to play cowpasture football on some pretty rough territory. There was one field that had no grass left on it. It was no school playground. And the only time you'd see any grass is like by August when school was starting again. But we would play cowpasture football, tackle, and there were rocks everywhere. So when you fell, you had to know where the big rocks were. No helmets, no pads. We had so much more fun than playing organized football, because I always say any organized sport I ever played was so much fun before adults got involved. And it was pretty rough. I mean, it was really rough. And there was this little guy. And I remember when he would get the ball and he would run, and somebody was always sooner or later going to catch up with him and tackle him, and he would tackle him. And then his face would turn red, and he'd jump up and say, "You make me so mad." Well, you had the ball. What did you expect we were going to do? And it reminded me that that's what we do. We plot a course of action. We take our course of action, and then when the response is not what we wanted to happen, we jump up and we scream, "You make me so mad." We need to live our lives in such a way that we attempt to stay in the spirit of love and gentleness. If not, we find ourselves constantly angry, constantly on the edge, constantly responding to that evil that would be within us. Jesus' way is a more excellent way. Young woman who's made lots of headlines out in Colorado, Nadia Bowles-Weber, who has recaptured the spirit of Martin Luther for the Lutherans, some of whom have forgotten it. And the name of this church she founded was House of All Saints and Sinners. And it was that Lutheran concept that within us is always a saint and a sinner. No matter what we may say about ourselves, no matter how we frame ourselves, it's always within us. The question in these cases of how we respond to anger is, what is it that we're going to do? What part of us are we going to respond to? And Jesus is saying clearly, you've heard it said, but listen, there's another way. Be ready so that you always respond with that spirit of saint. Be ready so that others don't get clobbered. Be ready so that the world is a better place, a more humane place because you walk through it. Be ready because love is always what God is expecting. And love will always take us down the road which we need to go. My prayer today for me, and you on the side, since I'm worse than most of you, I pray for me more than you. My prayer today for us is that in a society that is uncontrollably angry, with violence seeping out of every crevice, that we claim that spirit of gentility and that we embody the Spirit of God. And by embodying that Spirit, it may be a witness for others who need to know that they are loved, made in the image of God, and can live that way. May God help us.